Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Anthropology 415, 593. It's week 10? Week 10. Crazy. How did we get here? It seemed like we just started. We're going to do surveys this week. We're going to be chapter 10, in which we talk about structured interviews for the first time. Like I said, last week, I did make some changes to the syllabus. First of those being I split up week 10 and 11 into 2 weeks. So we can focus on surveys this week, and we'll do structural domain analysis next week, which is always my favorite, and I feel like it gets kind of short shift. So hopefully we'll get to spend some time on it, and we'll do free list and pile sorts and all those fun game things next week. So this week we're going to be talking about topics. Hang on. It doesn't ring quite so much. We'll be thinking about this. You got a discussion board, you got a homework and a quiz. Discussion board 8, homework 7, and quiz 7. Remember, you only have 10 discussion boards, 10 quizzes, and 8 homework. So after this week, only 1 more homework. We're almost done. Welcome, Megan. We're talking about surveys today. You'll be doing a discussion board about what are 3 challenges you might face when conducting the survey portion of your research, and how would you overcome these goals, be specific. You'll also be thinking about quiz questions like what are some challenges involved in getting people to respond to your survey. 3 ways to improve your survey's response rate, which we'll talk about a little bit today, probably on Friday. We're going to talk today about writing good questions on your survey. So how can survey questions be misinterpreted by the person taking the survey, and what are at least 3 ways to avoid misinterpretation? And today we're also going to talk about the different ways you can give a survey. You can give a survey face-to-face, you can call somebody on the telephone, or you can use the internet or a computer. What are the pros and cons of each, and what factors help you decide which to use? So good stuff, and we'll talk about all that this week. We'll also, on Wednesday, I love activities, so we're going to do our survey activity. It's going to be your homework if you are here. You're going to have a chance to start this in class. If you are not here, you'll have to do it on your own. But you have this video to help guide you. So we'll be doing that. We're going to construct a brief survey in class. You're going to start making your survey. Then you're going to give it to one of your classmates, and you're going to see if it works, or you're going to see what's broken, and then you're going to swap your survey with someone else, and they're going to look at your survey, and they're going to make any corrections or suggestions that you that might be good, either to test the validity or the reliability, the operationalization of your variables, or maybe even just your word choice. So we'll be starting that in class on Wednesday. If you're here, you'll get a good head start on your homework, and if you're not, you'll be able to do that on your own. Okay. So what do you think? We'll start with this. What do we mean by surveys? We've done a couple different methods in here. We've done participant observation and field notes. We kind of did that for 2 weeks. And then last week we did semi-structured interviews. And so this week and next week, we're moving on to what Bernard lumps together as structured interviews, and the first of these being a survey. So what do we think of when we hear the word survey? What kind of, have you ever done a survey before? I'm sure you have if you've taken classes at Eastern. So what's a survey look like? Yeah, right. These are 2 different kinds of questions. Do you know what we call those different kinds? What was that? Yeah, closed or open-ended, right? Do you give people the choices, right? What do you think of Dr. Stanley's teaching techniques? Strongly above average, or average, below average, strongly below average, or something like that, right? You could also have the open-ended questions, like at the end of your teaching surveys, you always get, if you have any other comments you'd love to share with us, please write it in the box, right? So these are the 2 different things you might get. You might also get different kinds of questions, right? Some might be on the content. What did you think of Dr. Stanley's class? How was he in responding to emails? What about homework? You might also get demographic questions. Think about your student surveys. Those first couple of questions that are on there, they ask you things like what? What kind of demographic questions do they ask you? Yeah, are you a freshman, sophomore, junior? You might also, maybe not on that one, but on other ones, they might ask you demographic questions about your age. It could be a specific number, or it could be one of those like age ranges, right? So are you below 18? Are you 19 to 34, 35 to 55, or above 56 or something, right? They might also do income. Again, this can be open-ended or closed-end. Write how much money you make in the box, question, or pick your salary range, right? Is it under 20,000, between 21 and 50,000, 51 to 100, or above 100, or something like that, right? So two different kinds of questions. Why do you think you might need both in a survey? And you'll see this on your homework. We're going to have you write both kinds of questions. What do you think, Jose? Why would you need both kinds of questions on your survey? Why not just one or the other? Why don't I just ask you about your opinions?
More information. Maybe the students want to expand more on that question, better answer to it, and maybe want to explain why certain things they did, like longevity to for the water. Well, I don't have the money for the household.
So why would I want demographic type questions and not just content questions? Why not just how much water do you use? Why do I actually care about what your gender is, what your age is, or your income? Why would I care? Why is that important to include as well? What do you think, Sam? Why is it important to include demographic questions and not just content, right? So if you're studying religion and water, and I ask you all these religion and water questions, why is it also important for me to ask things like your age, your gender, or your income, or something like that, right? Maybe not all those questions, but some kind of demographic questions. Yeah. Right, if I don't ask that, I might be like, huh, it's really weird that like half of my surveys say that they use a lot of water and half of my surveys say they don't. But I don't know which half, right? I don't have any way of doing this. If you were doing face-to-face interviews, you might be able to eyeball that kind of thing, even if you didn't ask direct demographic questions, right? You might not, who knows anymore, you can accurately judge this, but you might be able to judge someone's age or their income or their gender based on those kind of interview characteristics. If you're getting a survey back, especially if you're doing one over the phone or doing it on the internet or by mail, you don't know. So it's important to take those kind of questions because there may be some kind of salient variable there. And we'll talk again tomorrow or Wednesday about how much is too much with those. Okay, so there's lots of different kinds of surveys. You might get open-ended questions like, what are some challenges you faced? What would you like us to know about it? Is there anything else you can know? Describe your experience, right? Those are all open-ended questions in which your people can write, either write or you can write for them sentences, paragraphs, maybe even pages worth of interesting stuff. On the other hand, you might get something like this, right? This is a closed question. I'm planning to buy this product again. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. What are the pros and cons of the different kinds of questions? Why, in what cases may I want to use open-ended versus closed-ended questions? This is a good quiz question. Definitely, right? You can write, yeah, right, strongly disagree. Well, why did you strongly disagree? It doesn't tell you why. And you might get 3 people who strongly disagree with I'm going to buy this product again, but they might all strongly disagree for different reasons. One, this package came 2 weeks late. The other way, we got run over by the UPS truck. And the other one, I didn't like the color, right? Or something like that. All 3 different reasons, but you wouldn't be able to disaggregate that from a strongly disagree, click on a button. What's up, John? Talking about surveys today. So why don't we just use all open-ended? If these give us more detail than this, why not just use that? What do you think, Caitlin? Definitely, right? How do I group open-ended questions together, right? If I say, this question, I'm planning on buying this product again, I can group all those together. I can say I have 7 strongly disagrees, 3 disagrees, 2 neutrals. And if I do it open-ended and one person's like, I didn't like the color, one person says I got run over by UPS, and one person just kind of, is ambivalent, I might have a hard time figuring out how to group those together. Are they really the same thing, or should I make separate categories? So I need a separate category for I won't buy this again because of the color or something, or because it smelled weird when I got it. Or do I have to group those together? And how do I do it, right? And different researchers might group those together differently. It might also just be difficult to put what they write in words into some kind of numerical value for analysis, right? It becomes kind of almost more like an interview where you get a lot of why and how data, but you don't really get that quantitative quite as much from an open-ended question. So we're going to use both, and you'll see in your homework activity this week on Wednesday, I'll have you create demographic questions. We're also going to do open-ended questions and closed-end questions as well. So when you do a survey, there's a number of different ways you can do it, and you might have different opportunities to do it, use different modes in this class or in other future avenues of research. The three big ones which he talks about are face-to-face surveys, phone surveys, or self-administered surveys. And those can either be paper or, this was brand new when this came out, computer, right, or on the internet. People used to do more phone surveys, and I think it's kind of falling out of fashion, but we'll still talk about them and think about what are some of the pros and cons of each. So we'll start with face-to-face. In many ways, face-to-face is a natural bridge from doing your interviews last week, right? Your semi-structured interviews. You had some questions. I gave you some questions. But did you go straight down the list of questions when you did that? Or did you jump around or ask other questions that weren't on the list? Yeah, ask other questions. Did anybody use all the questions? You kind of picked and choose. It seemed like maybe you jumped around in different orders, or maybe you asked follow-up questions that you're like, oh, it's really interesting. I'm going to go on this digression about the history of colonialism in Puerto Rico, right? It might start a discussion. That's going to be different from a closed-ended survey, right? In a survey, you're not going to have those opportunities to kind of go off script. You want to like follow the script. And we as cultural anthropologists, we like to think of ourselves as, free thinkers. We'll just do what we kind of want or what feels best for the situation. But why might we want to use a survey where you don't go off script? Seems very antithetical to, when we've been talking about participant observation and just kind of hanging out and talking to people with questions. So why might I be interested in following a script? Yeah.
Same reason you're doing a code sheet the same way every time.
Why is that?
As Kate was sort of brought up, I mean, if you go off script, well, it may provide you with more information. If you didn't ask that same question to everybody,
Yep.
it provides you no physical data.
Yeah, it doesn't allow you to compare, right?
And that's the whole sort of point.
Yeah.
The survey is that you can both get it completely unbiased. You're not asked the question.
Yep.
The survey, so.
Yeah, you're trying to get rid of that.
All of those like compounds.
Yep.
Addition, you should be able to get the same style of answer.
Yep.
Everybody, you should be able to take that to like, there's all kinds of fun data crunching programs.
Yeah, and do some kind of analysis with that, right? Get some bigger picture data rather than maybe just this idiosyncratic or personal answers about why or how. Yeah, I think that's great. You're trying to, with a survey, by asking the same questions in the same order, and even doing it over the telephone or over the computer, trying to remove compounds, right? Especially ones related to you, the way that you ask them, the order that you do, maybe the situation. You're trying to control for variables. And so we'll talk a little bit now about the different types and what are some of the pros and cons of each. So there's three different kinds we'll talk about. First is a face-to-face type survey. And then we have the self-administered and the telephone. Actually, I wanted to show you before we get into it. Anthropologists, we typically don't think of surveys as like an anthropology thing, right? We think of that as sociology. They do big data, we do participant observation and deepening out. These surveys have been a big part of the discipline for a very long time, for at least 150, if not more years. If you remember back to the theory class, when we talked about some of those real old time anthropologists like W.H.R. Rivers and those British guys who went around doing the veranda anthropology, one thing they carried with them when they went into the field was this book, Notes and Queries on Anthropology. I have to say it like a British person when you read it. And it's basically a book-long survey that you can do if you were the colonial gentleman, because they were all colonial, and they were all gentlemen, and you went into this strange place and nobody knew anything about this culture. Here's a book. Go through the entire book, ask every question in the book, and you'll have a good idea of that culture. And if you're interested, I have the book up here. I have like the last edition. This is 1961, I think. I think the first edition is like 1883, you know. So it's a pretty old book, and has many of the famous British anthropologists like Raymond Firth and Evans Pritchard, Radcliffe, Brown, you know, W.H.R. Rivers, all those big guys were contributors to this book. And it's got questions. You can find it online. Type in notes and queries. This is a scan of the last one. So for instance, and it's kind of set up in the same way that Morgan's HRAF files are, right? So it's kind of like, oh, here's the section on kinship, here's a chapter on religion, here's a chapter on, you know, economics, here's a chapter on agriculture, right? So on the section 103 on idolatry, are there images made to represent demons and deities? Do they receive worship by prayers and sacrifice? Do they have temples and priests? Do they consume food, give oracle answers, speak, nod, wink, plead, walk around, act otherwise? How do they do this? Are idols representative of spirit beings? All right, you can kind of just go through this book, and the idea is kind of do a survey of the culture and get a good idea of what's going on there. So it's a big part of anthropology, and we've been doing these for a very long time. And if you were W.H.R. Rivers or someone like that, and you were taking notes and queries into the field, probably what kind of survey you would do would be a face-to-face survey. Why is that? Why, if I'm interested in what is the relationship between kinship and land tenure in this society, why might I ask people questions face-to-face? I'm an old-time anthropologist. Why don't I call them on the telephone or ask them, send them a thing in the mail or, you know, an internet survey?
Well, first of all, you control for certain concepts if they're in person. Like, you can make sure that everybody understands the question the same way.
Definitely, right? You can explain it.
Verify that they understand.
Yeah, so you can explain it. What else might be a reason why? What's an advantage of face-to-face surveys? Of me asking you my questions directly. What was that? You can see their body language. You might get other information. What else? I have 7 of these actually. So feel free to chime in. Everyone gets a chance. What do you think, Caitlin? An advantage of face-to-face surveys. Why might I want to do my survey and just ask you the questions? What's the reason?
Also get more information and if something comes with it.
Yeah, right. Maybe they'll be more willing to answer the question. Maybe the people you're asking the question to don't have phones. Maybe they don't have mail. Maybe they don't have internet. Maybe they can't even read, right? A lot of societies, especially if you're trying to do a good cross section of you know, a traditional society, most people in San Jose Village, older than I am, never went to school beyond 6th grade. So reading comprehension is pretty low in that. There is no mail delivery in the village. You have to go to town 3 hours away and ask at the post window to see if you have any mail. Most people do it 2 or 3 times a year. And even if you do have internet, maybe you don't have signal or you have to pay by the minute, right? So in a lot of cases, going face-to-face and asking your questions is a really great way of doing it. It's like Caitlin said, you can explain a little bit more. You can also use visual aids, right? I can say, you can even know, hold up a picture and say, did you like the movie Prey? I can ask you that in a survey, just ask you, but I can also show you the picture and I might jog your memory and get more response by doing it that way. Yeah, so a number of advantages you can use with illiterate, non-literate people. You can use with old people who maybe can't read very well. You can use it with blind people or other people who have problems taking surveys. If you don't understand a question, you can always explain it, but then it leads to the problem of validity, right? If you're not explaining if you're not explaining the question to every person, is it really valid, right? Because people are getting different inputs there, and we're trying to control for that. It can be multimodal. Another benefit is that you know who answers the question. Okay? This is the problem with especially internet or mailed out surveys, right? The survey comes to your house, you pick it up in the mail, you throw it on the table, and your little kid comes by with a crayon and fills out all the check boxes, right? As a researcher, when I get that back, I might be able to interpret the crayon as maybe a kid did it, but other than that, I won't actually know who did that unless I include demographic data. Another advantage is that it can be longer. People tend to have more patience, I guess, for in-person, face-to-face kind of surveys than if you're on the telephone, right? You get bored and you might hang up much quicker. There are disadvantages, right? So, well, why don't we do just face-to-face? Well, it's expensive, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money. If you are like a hardcore survey researcher and you're going to interview people face-to-face, Bernard says you can only get about 200 a year. And even then you're going to be super burned out. This is, just a drop in the bucket compared to what you could get if you use direct mailing or use an internet or telephone survey, when you can do tens of thousands or even millions of people a year. So it costs time, it costs money. Because it takes a long time, sometimes if you're asking about current events, the current events can happen, right? Or they can move on in history. I can ask, I'm going to do a survey, a face-to-face survey with 200 people this year about the war in Ukraine, right? If I've been doing it all year, the events have changed over time, right? The events in Ukraine are very different now than they were in January or in February or even the summer, right? So I'm going to have maybe different opinions on should the US support the Ukraine, right? And people in February maybe weren't as supportive, but now in September, October, they're much more supportive or something like that. Another problem is you might get a difference between what people are actually saying and what they're doing, right? Versus participant observation, because people might say that they do something, but you actually don't know. This is going to be a problem with all of them. The second of these is a mailed survey. Has anyone received a survey in the mail? Or are you all too young? You don't get mail. You ever get a survey? No. Sometimes I get these. Or if you, oftentimes there'll be like a voter participation survey, right? Or asking you about your political beliefs on something. Do you think that you should vote for this or that this policy is good or bad? They can also be consumer marketing surveys. Again, this makes me sound old. They used to send out surveys, I think they still do, about like what you watch on TV, the Nielsen surveys, right? What shows did you watch on Tuesday between 9 and midnight? Write down what shows, or you click which shows or something like that. I think it's online now, right? And these are very common. They're not quite as common as they used to, but a lot of your mail used to be kind of survey stuff. It has a lot of advantages in many ways. Again, you can do a whole lot more. You can get into the phone book, you look at every address, and you can mail out surveys to everybody in Portales pretty easily. Much easier than going around and trying to face-to-face survey every person in Portales. Another benefit is that it gets rid of some of your interview biases, right? Especially if you have more than one, right? I'm going to try to interview every person in Portales, or I'm going to do a face-to-face survey, right? I'm not going to be able to do that by myself. So maybe I'll recruit more people to help me. But then we have the problem of bias, right? How do I make sure that all the interviewers are asking the same kind of questions? And how do I make sure that, I'm getting the same kind of responses as Jose? Maybe people are treating us differently because of our age or something like that. Another benefit of kind of the self-administered type questions, either by mail or by computer, is that you can ask kind of long list of boring questions, right? How do you feel about, I have to do these all the time, they send out like for the financial things if you're at work, and they're like, which of these companies, or what are your views on these companies, right? Morgan Stanley, TIAA, Wells Fargo, right? This whole list of companies, and you say, I like them, I don't like them, I have no opinion, right? So if somebody is asking you that in person, maybe you get bored after 5 or 10, but on kind of a self-administered survey, you can just kind of click all the boxes. Another benefit is that people are much more likely in a self-administered, either on computer or on the mail, to admit to behavior that maybe they wouldn't do in person, right? Because there's no one judging you. You're just kind of alone with your survey form, and they've told you that it's confidential or anonymous. So you feel more comfortable sharing things that maybe you wouldn't do in person. But again, there are disadvantages. One of these is you can't go back and help people with interpretation. And this becomes a real big problem. We'll talk about this when you're creating your questions in just a minute. But the bigger your population, it's actually really hard to make questions that are both simple enough for people, for some people to understand, but also not too simple for other people that you insult their intelligence, right? So if you're doing a face-to-face survey and someone doesn't understand a term, you can explain it to them. But in a computer or a mailed off survey, you know, there's no way for you to do that. And people might interpret questions differently. So for instance, we'll come back to this one. If you have a question that says, how many times did you go to the doctor last year? Straightforward question. Why might that be a problem? You know, if you're taking a self-administered survey, why might there be a problem of interpretation with that? How might that be misinterpreted? How many times did you go to the doctor last year? Seems straightforward. There's different kinds of doctors. I had to go to sports medicine for my knee last year. Is that a doctor? Maybe. I went to get acupuncture last year. Is that a doctor? I went to La Casa and they don't have doctors there. They only have nurse practitioners. Is that a doctor? Right? Some people might say yes to all three questions. Other people might have more varied answers or say no to all of them. And when you get all those back, because especially if they're closed-ended or they're just filling in a number or checking a box, you don't actually know, right? They didn't actually write out. I went to primary care 3 times. I went to see a nurse practitioner twice, an acupuncture once, and a chiropractor once or something like that. Another one is you often have problems like we talked about in the third world. If you're doing computer or mail surveys, people don't have that kind of stuff. And even here in rural New Mexico, you have that problem. I think it's really interesting how fast things have changed though. Bernard's book was 2008 and he's like, phone surveys are way better because everyone has a phone. 95% of people have a phone, but most people don't have the internet yet. Only 24% of people in 2008 who didn't have a high school education had the internet. I would guess that number is much higher today, but we still have that problem, especially with internet type surveys that people, not as much as before, but tend to be over educated or over income compared to general population. But again, that's changing as more people have access to the internet. Bernard really likes phone interviews. I think that is a sign of his age and when he was doing research, because how many of you have ever answered a phone interview? When they call on your phone and they're like, hey, don't hang up. This is a survey from candidate such and such, and we want to ask you about something. And they all talk really fast because they know you're on the way to hang up. Have you ever asked these? When I was like a youth, this is what I did for a job, right? Calling people on the phone and asking them. And it's terrible. Like, I hate that job, right? Because people like hang up all the time. Nobody wants to take phone surveys. I think people used to like them more because it was like new and exciting and you felt like you could like influence things. But I think increasingly, have you ever taken a phone survey?
Only if I knew I was going to get a phone survey.
Yeah.
If I like have known in person, like was like informed on.
If there was like a follow-up survey, yeah.
To sign up, and they start with, hey, you signed up for this.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, maybe.
Or you might get it like if you went to the doctor or something and they're like, hey, we're going to call you about your experience or something like that,
Also,
right?
if there's like
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that we'll talk about that more with response rates, but it is kind of an interesting question. Do you think it's ethical to incentivize people to do a survey?
If you're creative, here's the thing, right? When it comes into talk about the fact that the majority of the college stuff, teaching jobs is over jobs, building corporate surveys, doing that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that it would be ethical if I was studying like I don't know, ecofeminism amongst the Maya, but like if I was studying like who likes what product best or how our store performing, things like that, then yeah, that's the standard.
Yeah.
That's how things are done.
The thing is to make sure though is that you do it equally, right? You might skew your answers if I only gave a few people incentives, right? Some people got $10 to do this survey, some people didn't. And especially if that was not completely random, right? I gave people on this side of town money and the other people didn't get it. So maybe it skews my results. And sometimes that can even be like a non-monetary. I give you this pen, right? And Bernard says that even if you give somebody a non-monetary gift, it increases your response rate. But again, you have these issues of like both ethics. Should I do this? Does it skew my results? But also cost, right? If I'm going to give everybody $5 to participate in my survey, how much is that going to cost when I have 1 million people in my survey?
You can also get people that come really interested, especially if they're like,
Mhm.
something that I recall very clearly is, the only phone survey I ever ran was Jack in the Box.
Yeah.
For years and years and years, Jack in the Box corporate survey would give you a coupon, 2 free tacos.
Yeah.
Any purchase, including if you purchase 50-cent 2 free tacos. And so every day I would do the phone survey at a Jack in the Box, and I would get 4 tacos for $1. It's so bad, my friends would call me taco. But the point was, I was probably churning out 300 surveys in that year that I was eating tacos.
Yeah.
And I listened to like the #1 review for all.
And that's another thing, like if you have the opportunity to take a survey more than once, you might have some people who take the surveys a lot and are overrepresented in your survey versus people who take them once or not at all, right? So it's kind of hard to aggregate if you give people the opportunity to take it as many times as you like, because maybe you get overrepresentative, Jack in the Box
And
fans.
that's why they stopped that. The surveys don't ask things that are about like my subjective feelings.
Yeah.
I know they're gonna have over.
Yeah.
So they don't ask those questions.
Yeah.
They ask like, how clean was the outside of the building?
Yeah. How was your bathrooms or whatever like
Like,
that?
I can answer that honestly. How clean was that sitting out there doing the survey as a fucking tacos? Like, pretty fucking shitty. They got 1.
Yeah.
Things like that. Stuff that like even if you overrepresent certain population, they're about the current condition of
Yep.
the restaurant.
Yeah. And so kind of in the last 15 minutes or so of class, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but one of the biggest problems with surveys, no matter what mode you use, is writing your questions in a way that are both clear and unambiguous to the people reading them, and that produce like responses from different people reading them, right? So you got to make sure that young people and old people are interpreting questions similarly, right? Sometimes old people and young people, even if they use the same words, can have very different meanings. Similarly, populations, whether it's gender or whether it's ethnicity, right? You might think it's a perfectly clear question, but other people might not think so. So on Wednesday, we're going to be practicing. You're going to write some questions and we're going to swap them, and we're going to see if anybody has any issues. What do you think are some of the keys to, actually, let me show this video first, and then we'll talk about what are some of the keys to writing a good survey question. So we'll watch this video and we'll think about some issues.
Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm going to talk about
Too
question
fast.
9 in the Generical Survey. This video follows on from another video, Designing a Questionnaire. These ideas are also useful for critiquing a questionnaire or survey. It is very important that the questions in the questionnaire are well written to find out what you want to know and to avoid bias or non-sampling error. There are different types of questions. Open questions let the respondent say what they like, while closed questions give respondents a choice of response. Open questions are useful when you do not know how people are likely to respond, or when you want to avoid influencing your response. But open questions can be very difficult to analyse, as there are so many different ways that they can be answered. You might think that it is easy to ask good questions in a questionnaire, but it isn't. You want to make it as easy as possible for the respondent to give you the information you want. To start with, the questions should be as short as possible. Questions need to have correct spelling and grammar. Questions should use language appropriate to the subject and the people you are asking. If you are asking experts, you can use technical language, but generally you need to keep the language simple. It is usually better to ask what a person did in a certain instance or over a certain period of time than for them to record in general what happens. But you need to be realistic about what you can expect people to remember. And you need to define your terms. It is important to have just one idea in a question. If there are two ideas, use two questions. It is better to ask questions in positive terms if possible. Avoid a double negative, as that can be very confusing. In closed questions, you need to be careful about the alternatives you provide. You need to make it clear whether the person is supposed to choose one alternative or as many as they wish. And you need to make sure that the alternative choices do not overlap and that they cover the whole range of alternatives. Often a category other can be used for alternatives you might have missed. You want to avoid influencing people's response, which can lead to non-sampling error. So you need to word the question as neutrally as possible. You need to be careful if you are asking a question that may be personal or upsetting. As we described in our previous video, it is very important to check your questions with a pilot survey, as this will identify potential problems. The more effort you put into devising the questions, the better quality data you will get. This video was brought to you by Statistics Learning Centre.
Okay. Thank you, Statistics Learning Center. So what are some of the things either you learned in the video or that you think of? What should you be concerned of when you are writing your survey questions? There are some ways that you might make your questions more clear.
I think it generally boils down to, you want your questions to be understood pretty much the same way by pretty much everybody. And
Definitely.
anything you're doing that throws that off in any direction is you fucking up. Like,
Yeah.
You shouldn't have double negatives because that might confuse some people.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do you
just-
disagree with the
just
fact
down
that chocolate is not good for you? Or not bad for you or something like that, right? So you double negatives, confusing language, jargon, right? I saw this when I worked in chocolate industry. We used to go around and give surveys to people. And it's super similar to what we do here at the university. It was like an assessment thing where you do a pre-test, then I'm going to do a training, and then I'm going to test people afterwards, and I'm going to show you how much they learned, right? So they would ask questions like, do you practice shade auto planification to these like Maya farmers who first language was not English, right? So what does that mean? These are like technical agronomy terms that you'd have to explain. If you're going to explain things and you're going to have to like tell people what things are, it might be better just to do an interview, right? Because then you can explain it and you can figure it out. You also have to worry about really long questions. Why might long questions or multi-parted questions be a problem?
They might not get understood the same way.
Yeah.
Some people might, if you ask multi-part questions, somebody might spend more time on one part of the question and then neglect the other side of that question. And now you're screwed because somebody else did the
Yep.
opposite way. And how are you going to make quantitative data out of that?
So Bernard gives the great example of, bad multi-parted question. Do you believe marijuana is as harmless as alcohol and should be legal? Why is that a bad question? It's just an opinion question, right? Why is that a bad question? Do you believe that marijuana is as harmless as alcohol and should be legal? Someone else.
Is harmless alcohol necessarily should be legal.
Exactly, right? Someone might agree with the first statement and not the second. It's as harmless as alcohol, but should be illegal. Or they could do the opposite, right? I don't agree that it's as harmless as alcohol, but I also agree that it should be legal. And you won't be able to tell. Better to ask that as two separate questions, right? Do you think that marijuana is as harmless as alcohol? Yes or no? Strongly disagree. Agree. And do you think it should be legal, right? So that way you can disaggregate those kind of questions. And kind of the flip side of what we were talking about earlier with using jargon, you also don't want to insult people's intelligence, right? If you're asking survey, if your survey is asking water managers about water use, you want to make sure that you're using that kind of technical jargon that they understand or things that is on their levels. Not just like, oh, how much water you use, but like, how many gallons you use. That's a more specific term, which would be more appropriate for that population. You also want to provide alternatives in your questions, especially if you're doing yes or no type or closed-ended questions. How much chocolate did you eat last year? One bar, 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars. or last week. So how many chocolate bars did you eat last week? 1, 2, 3, 4. Check the box that applies. What's wrong with that question? There's no zero. You ate 5, right? So yeah, right. Or what type of chocolate did you eat last week? Light, dark, white chocolate. What's the problem with that question? All kinds of chocolate. It's unclear if that question is mutually exclusive, right? Do I have to just pick one, or can I pick more than one? So when you write your survey questions, make sure to tell people if something is a choose one kind of answer, or if it's a choose as many as you can, right? We see this all the time. This is a huge problem here at internal research at the university when they do things like, student, pick your major from this list. Pick whatever your major is. Choose one box. Why is that a problem? There's a bunch of double majors, and there's a bunch of people who aren't any majors, right? There are non-degree seeking students here as well, whether you're dual enrollment or you're a retiree who's just coming back to take classes. So it throws off the surveys all the time because they didn't code a button for double major or I have no major or something like that. So you need to make sure you think of those alternatives. And a great way of doing that is to do a pilot study. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday, and you're going to have a chance to do it. You basically take your questions and you're like, these questions are awesome. And then you take them out into the wild and you're like, oh my gosh, these don't work at all, or these are broken. So you always want to practice with it before you send it out to 100,000 people. Why?
Once the census goes out, no change in the census.
There's no
That's why they give you, what is it, 6 years?
To get it right.
Retool the census in between time, because once the census goes out, like,
you can't fix it, right? Or you have to wait another 10 years, right? And it's going to mess up your data, and you can't give it a second time, right? I can't get a survey, send it out to all of you, and then be like, oh, that was a bad question, I should send it out again, right? Because people are going to be fed up with it, or they're not going to take it.
Controversy a couple of years ago is that they wanted to add a question to the census.
Yeah.
That was like somewhat politically driven about immigration, and like in the larger world, nothing, but like in the world of people who build their jobs out of research that uses census data, like that was game changing.
Well, and because it affects politics, right? So because of how you count people who are immigrants and whether they are showing up on the census or not, right, has to do with how many state representatives you have in your district and how much political power your state is. So certain people were against it, and certain people were for it, because it has these very political, real controversies. You also want to make sure that you keep threatening questions short. You don't want to have very long, complicated questions that people might be put off on it. So if you're going to like ask something controversial, just get to the point and ask it. Also, make sure you don't jump around. Why might you want to make sure why might the order of your questions matter? What do you think, Jose? Why did the order of the questions on your survey matter? It's the exact same questions. I have 10 questions on 2 different surveys. Why do I care what order I put them in? Do you think it makes a difference? Yeah, you can't jump around, right? I'm going to ask you about your politics, then I'm going to ask you about your religion, then I'm going to go back to politics. You want to stay on the same wavelength, right? Make things naturally flow from one to the other. Do you think the order of your questions can impact your survey results? What do you think, Megan? How so? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I call it the haunted house, right? You need to lead them through in a certain way that they have the experience that you want. Oftentimes you start with demographic questions because they're the least threatening, right? How much money do you make? What's your gender? How old are you? These are like kind of basic questions, and you get people in the habit of like filling in the bubbles. Why don't I want to start off with the question of how much heroin did you do last year? Just jump right into it. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. You want to like ease them in, you want to make them comfortable, and you can actually get really different responses. One of what Bernard talks about in some of his stuff is that, the order of the questions makes a big difference in your response rate. And if you have kind of those controversial questions first, people are going to be put off to it, and less likely to answer not only that question, but other questions later on in the survey as well. Another thing that you want to make sure is that you avoid like loaded questions or emotionally charged questions, right? We all know that anthropology is the best major, so what is your major, right? Kind of loads the question. Or don't you agree with the president that we should be doing X, Y, and Z? Or maybe you put a little bit of emotional language in there, right? What about, do you agree with helping the Ukraine in this horrible war that Russia has perpetrated on them, right? You might get one very different response than if you had framed that question in a kind of more neutral way. And the last thing we're talking about is surveys are super complicated in writing well, it's complicated to write a good question. You need to practice it. Even when you're doing something in your own language or even in a place you're familiar with, right? You're all doing research here in Eastern New Mexico, and even if you're not all from here exactly, you've all lived here and going to school here. So you know the language, you know the general topography and what people are like. What might be a problem with doing a survey in a culture or a language that is not your first language or culture? But additional issues might come reading. Yeah, right. The translation is a big deal because especially if it's not your first language, oftentimes you might translate, or it might even be a correct translation, but it might have different meanings, right? So for example, if you were studying mental health in a Maya indigenous community, right? You might ask people, do you have, and you can go through the whole list of mental health questions, right? Do you have anxiety? Do you have depression? Do you have, bipolar or schizophrenia, all these kinds of things? And they'll look at you and they'll be like, I don't know what that is. Because all those get lumped together in Maya under crazy, right? Are you crazy is basically what you would write, because that's like the only category they have for all that stuff. And then if you translated that back into English, you might be shocked and horrified, right? You're like, that's not what I mean at all. Okay? I'm offended with this question, right? So he says it's important to do both translations and then back translate, right? So if you're having, especially if someone else is translating for you, have them translate it and then give it to a third party and have them translate it back to English or whatever language you started in. Because that'll be a really great way of seeing if that translation is right or if something got lost.
It's actually a great way to probably track automatic translation.
Definitely. If you've ever used Google Translate.
Run translation back.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. A lot of times people will be like, I'll just take this survey question, I'll throw it in Google Translate and it'll be perfect. But it's more complicated. So next time we're going to be looking at designing a survey, and you're going to have an opportunity to work on your homework, and we'll see what each other creates for our survey questions. So that's it for today. Thanks so much.